Recording.
Okay. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back, Gulienne. Wonderful to see you again. This is the second of our mini-series within the broader series, and the final within our broader series of exploring Judaism and race, something that's been on a lot of our minds for a long time, and especially this summer. And we had a wonderful first session with Gulienne that I was able to catch most of, but I'm excited today to be able to be more fully present for this session. Gulienne, as I shared last time, is a dynamic educator and thinker and writer and thought leader on issues of identity and culture and race and religion. She's also a friend and someone that I've learned a lot from, and just appreciate her sharing her wisdom and her time with us all the way from New York. And I just also want to extend my gratitude to Elliot for really masterminding this whole series. Going back for months now, we've been planning this pre-COVID to do some real deep thinking about Judaism and race and whiteness. And we were able to parlay that structure into a broader structure this summer, which has, I think, just been really fruitful for our community and an important conversation that we all need to have. And not just a conversation, but some action that we need to take. And that's, I think, what today is going to focus on a little bit. As Julienne's been bringing us, how do we take some of the theory and really integrate it into our lives, into our community, into just who we are and how we are in the world. And that's very exciting and very important. So Julie, I turn it over to you, Julienne, to lead us. And again, just my gratitude to you and to Elliot for making this possible for our community. And I'm going to take myself off the screen because you don't need to look at me. So I'm going to hide myself and hello, Julienne.
Don't worry, Ravari, you're going to be back at some point because hopefully, again, we'll get to all turn on our screens and be a little bit more interactive. Thank you for that awesome introduction. It's really a pleasure to be back and working with you guys again. And thank you, Elliot, and all the rest of the Agudath Jacob staff who has helped put this together and really done the work to make sure that this is a conversation that people are having with a lot of information and processing and moments for compassion and empathy, both for people who are not themselves, people who are sort of other, and for themselves. It's the most important way, I think, to be able to have actual interracial dialogue and interethnic dialogue. So I welcome you guys back. I hope that you've digested the information well and been able to work it sort of into your systems. And I want to talk about the fact that it's Elul right now, a little bit. We are getting very close to the Yamim Noraim. We're starting to think about a new year. We're starting to think about forgiveness for ourselves and others and what's that going to look like. We're starting to think about what we need to ask for, what we need in our lives, what we want written in the book for next year. I think I can say with a lot of confidence that probably none of us want COVID to exist next year. I think I can say with confidence that none of us want to see the level of violence, regardless of who we think is perpetrating it, that we've seen happen and that's made news and that's been going on as tensions are getting higher in this country in the next year. And I'm sure that as much as many of us are probably somewhat burnt out and we've been more isolated and it's been harder to make genuine human connection because we're not able to be in person as much, that we still all want to know, how can I be a part of making sure that things are better next year? How can I do my part? Where's my job in Tikkun Olam, in making sure that this world is a better place, in making sure that I ask for the forgiveness that I need to be asking for, and that I'm able to forgive myself, which is a step that I think a lot of people don't really talk so much about. It's something that 2 years ago actually for Yom Kippur, my entire thing that I did publicly as my asking for forgiveness was like a public letter of asking myself for forgiveness for the mistakes that I've made, and in so that I could genuinely ask from other people. Because if I don't even know how to ask myself for the forgiveness, then how on earth am I gonna feel like I even have the right to ask anybody else or receive it, or fully to give it to anybody else? Because if I can't even ask, never mind give myself the forgiveness, but if I can't even ask for the forgiveness from myself, then I have a very complicated relationship with making mistakes, which I think a lot of us do. We're very good at Jewish guilt. Um, but if that relationship with making mistakes is so difficult, then I'm going to keep judging myself and others for their mistakes. It's going to be harder to genuinely forgive, which is not the same thing as forget, to trust my own instincts in who I am and what I say and how I interact with people, and how I have any conversation, but especially ones as difficult and identity based as those around race and ethnicity and class and other things that that loaded word privilege gets tied to. And how can I move into next year with anything that even resembles a clean slate? So I think that that's a really good way to start off well, I guess not really start off anymore, but to be moving forward through a little, to be moving into the high holidays and to be moving into this conversation where I'm inviting everybody to kind of open themselves back up, and be vulnerable and accept vulnerability. Um, so I'm going to go over my group rules again because they are incredibly important. It is incredibly important to have a foundation of sort of the rules of engagement in any intense conversation. And this particular one may end up being more intense, may end up being less intense than any conversation you may go out there and have in your real life, with friends or with family or with, co-shul members, or with people who you're talking to across racial lines that are maybe strangers on the internet, but you're really trying to actually engage and learn from, especially as November approaches and everything is becoming divided, not just racially, but I would say politically, but I think it's sort of past political at this point. It's like, it's this whole big, everybody's talking about the narratives. And we spoke a little bit last time about storytelling. So we'll get into what it means to create a narrative, what it means to be told that this is just a single-minded narrative, how that ties into the idea of the single story, and why creating a set of rules of engagement before or even in the midst of intense conversations like this helps to make them actually about respect, and an actual exchange of ideas and just recognizing the peace of God inside of every human being, and that's why you're having the conversation, not to have a fight, not necessarily to change someone's mind, not necessarily even to have your mind changed, but to engage with another human being, another piece of this spark of echad, of the oneness that we all are. And often another piece of Am Yisrael, who you may have a very different opinion than and may have a lot of trouble understanding how on earth, and I say this because I feel it, but also because I've heard it echoed across the spectrum, how on earth could somebody take our values, our Torah, and believe that with all the finger pointing? So, rules of engagement. Rule number 1, we intend respect. Everything that we say, everything that we question, everything that we want to learn today is done with an understanding and a foundation of the intention of respect. Now, that doesn't mean our words are going to come out right. That doesn't mean I'm saying keep your mouth shut, please. If you can't say something in the most tactful way possible, there's probably going to be some chutzpah, and that's okay. But it means that you're coming from a place where your intention is to be respectful to another person, another idea, and the foundation of something. Next rule, which is sometimes even harder than intending respect, is assume that respect was intended. That is really, really hard. It's one of my favorite and least favorite things to do as a moderator when I'm on panels or, helping with questions in this kind of environment. But it is so important and so easy to forget. We've made the rule number one. Sometimes it's really hard to imagine how a question was phrased or a statement was made and respect was intended. So we're going to adopt an attitude of curiosity about that instead of reacting as though it triggered us. It may trigger us. We're allowed to have our own emotions about it. And instead of saying, "You're terrible, how could you even think of saying this?" you can say, "I'm having a really hard time understanding how you meant that respectfully. This is what I felt when I saw that or when I heard that. Can I share with you my first reaction to it? And can we talk about that? And maybe we'll find a way to understand it together." So the second main rule is we intend respect. That is also the third rule. That's how important it is. It is rules 2 and 3. And the fourth rule is, obviously this is recorded, it's going on the internet, and it should be hopefully watched by many, many other people. That being said, what's said here stays here. That doesn't mean you can't go and continue the conversation. And if you have permission from the people, you have permission from me. But if you have permission from the people, you're more than welcome to say, so-and-so said X, Y, Z. But it again goes all the way back to the respect. Like, people are hopefully going to be able to be vulnerable in this conversation. And to know that it's not going to be intentionally taken out of context and used as sort of a piece of, the rumor mill or gossip mongering is really important. So what's said here stays at least in context of here. And if you want to use an example that somebody gave or something that they said, just ask them. It's pretty simple. All you have to do is say, "Hey, I really loved what you said," or, "You know what, I found what you said really powerful and I want to use it as an example of somebody else who I think could learn from it." That's fine. Just ask. We're going to have that level of respect. So I just said a lot. I'm going to let you guys sort of digest that for a second while I move into this idea of privilege, which we started talking about a lot actually last month. And we discussed the idea that Jews, even ones who without a question or with hesitation click, white when they're answering a survey, have a complicated relationship with racial privilege and ethnic privilege, and sometimes even more complicated relationship with class privilege, because there's this assumption by people both who know us and who don't know us as a community that we're all rich, or at the very least, wealthy enough to be comfortable and in whatever we want. And that assumption can be very damaging, whether it's true or not in your particular situation. We talked a bit last time about how, especially right now with the pandemic, and so many things shifting for people's work situations, and that, it wasn't that long ago, the last time that the stock market crashed, and we see that it's sort of being okay right now, but that doesn't mean that we're not concerned about assets that we may have been able to put away. And our whole lifestyle has changed. Everyone's lifestyle has had to, well, almost everyone's lifestyle has had to change to some degree. So how do we relate to privilege now? So I would like to, I'm going to share my screen. And there's one thing that I'm going to have us read first, and then another that I'd like us to sort of go over and identify. And I will read it aloud as well. But feel free to mute me. I will put my hand up like this when I'm done. So if you want to read it yourself, you can. Years ago, some feminist on the internet told me I was privileged. The expletive, I said. I came from the kind of poor that people don't want to believe still exists in this country. Have you ever spent a frigid northern Illinois winter without heat or running water? I have. At 12 years old, were you making ramen noodles in a coffee maker with water you fetched from a public bathroom? I was. Have you ever lived in a camper year-round and used a random relative's apartment as your mailing address? We did. Did you attend so many different elementary schools that you can only remember a quarter of their names? Welcome to my childhood. So when that feminist told me I had white privilege, I told her that my white skin didn't do anything to prevent me from experiencing poverty. Then, like any good educated feminist would, she directed me to Peggy McIntosh's 1988 now famous piece, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. By the way, if any of you guys have not read that, I strongly suggest it. I think, I'm not going to say out of the scope of this particular conversation. It's very much in the scope of it, but I do think that it would lead us on a direction that would make it take much longer to try to have this conversation, which is why I'm not directly presenting it today. But I would definitely suggest reading it. After one reads McIntosh's powerful essay, it's impossible to deny that being born with white skin in America affords people certain unearned privileges in life that people of another skin color simply are not afforded. For example, I can turn on the television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. When I am told about our national heritage or civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. If a traffic cop pulls me over or the IRS audits my tax return, I can be sure I haven't been singled out because of my race. I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. That last one, I think, in some ways is another reason that Jews have a little bit of a complicated relationship with race, because I think there is often an assumption that white at least very strongly overlaps with WASP, with white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or at the very least Christian, but there are Catholics who have felt similarly. So I'm going to pause to acknowledge that. If you read the rest of the list, you can see how white people and people of color experience the world in two very different ways. But listen, this is not said to make white people feel guilty about their privilege. I want to highlight that again. This is not said to make white people feel guilty about their privilege. It's not your fault you were born with white skin and experienced these privileges. But whether you realize it or not, you do benefit from it. And it is your fault if you don't maintain awareness of that fact. And again, that's the fact that you benefit from having white skin in ways that people who don't have white skin are unfairly singled out a lot of times, just by dint of the color of our skin. I do understand McIntosh's essay may rub some people the wrong way. There are several points. Oh, hold on. I just lost my place, sorry. There are several points on the list that I felt spoke more to the author's status as a middle-class person than a white person. For example, if I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I would want to live. Now, again, I think that for anybody who is Jewish and at all involved in Jewish community, that is both, it's a class privilege and it's a religious privilege too, and that religious privilege is actually another social identity factor that gets discussed in the greater topic of social identity. I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. Again, for us all, that can be complicated. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. If I want to, I can be pretty sure of finding a publisher for this piece on white privilege. And there are so many more points in this essay where the word race could be substituted for the word class, which would ultimately paint a very different picture. That is why I had such a hard time identifying with this essay for so long. When I first wrote about white privilege years ago, I demanded to know why this white woman felt that my experiences were the same as hers when no, my family could most certainly not rent housing in an area which we could afford and want to live. And no, I couldn't go shopping without fear in our low-income neighborhoods. The idea that any old white person can find a publisher for a piece is most certainly a symptom of class privilege. Having come from a family of people who didn't even graduate high school, who knew not a single academic or intellectual person, it would never occur to me to assume that I could be published. It is an absolute freak anomaly that I'm in graduate school considering not one person on either side of my family has a college degree. And it took me until my 30s to ever believe that someone from my stock could achieve such a thing. Poverty colors nearly everything about your perspectives on opportunities for advancement in life. Middle-class, educated people assume that anyone can achieve their goals if they work hard enough. Folks steeped in poverty rarely see a life past working at the gas station, making rent on their trailer, and self-medicating with cigarettes and prescription drugs until they die of a heart attack. I've just described one whole side of my family and the life I assumed I'd be living before I lucked out of it. I, maybe more than most people, can completely understand why broke white folks get pissed when the word privilege is thrown around. As a child, I was constantly discriminated against because of my poverty, and those wounds still run very deep. But luckily, my college education introduced me to a more nuanced concept of privilege, the term intersectionality. The concept of intersectionality recognizes that people can be privileged in some ways and definitely not privileged in others. There are many different types of privilege, not just skin color privilege, that impact the way people can move through the world or are discriminated against. These are all things you are born into, not things you earned, that afford you opportunities others may not have. For example, citizenship. Simply being born in this country affords you certain privileges non-citizens will never access. Class. Being born into a financially stable family can help guarantee your health, happiness, safety, education, intelligence, and future opportunities. I have a little bit of an issue with the guarantee there, but it definitely has a big impact on it. Sexual orientation. By being born straight, every state in this country affords you privileges that non-straight folks have to fight the Supreme Court for. Sex. By being born assigned male at birth, you can assume that you can walk through a parking garage without worrying you'll be raped, and that a defense attorney will then blame it on what you were wearing. Ability. By being born able-bodied and minded, you probably don't have to plan your life around handicapped access, braille, or other special needs. Gender. By being born cisgendered, aka your gender matches the body parts you have, you aren't worried that the restroom or locker room you use will invoke public outrage. As you can see, belonging to one or more category of privilege, especially being a straight white, middle-class, able-bodied Christian male, can be like winning a lottery you didn't even know you were playing. But this is not to imply that any form of privilege is exactly the same as another, or that people lacking in one area of privilege understand what it's like to be lacking in other areas. Race discrimination is not equal to sex discrimination, and so forth. And listen, recognizing privilege doesn't mean suffering guilt or shame for your lot in life. Nobody's saying that straight, white, middle-class, able-bodied males are all a bunch of, I'll say schmucks, even though it's still not the nicest of words, who don't work hard for what they have. Recognizing privilege simply means being aware that some people have to work much harder just to experience the things you take for granted, if they ever can experience them at all. I now know that I am privileged in many ways. I am privileged as a natural-born white citizen. I am privileged as a cisgendered woman. I am privileged as an able-bodied person. I am privileged that my first language is also our national language, although we don't technically have a national language, and that I was born with an intellect and ambition that pulled me out of the poverty I was otherwise destined for. I was privileged to be able to marry my way up by partnering with a privileged middle-class educated male who fully expected me to earn a college degree. There are a million ways I experience privilege, and some that I certainly don't. But thankfully, intersectionality allows us to examine these varying dimensions and degrees of discrimination while raising awareness of the results of multiple systems of oppression at work. And I'm going to read this out. We don't have to necessarily answer it, but I think it's an interesting thing to discuss if we'd like. Tell me, are you a white person made uncomfortable by the term white privilege? Does a more nuanced approach help you see your own privilege more clearly? And I think that in our case, as we are discussing this, it can be, tell me, are you assumed to be a white person who is made uncomfortable by the term white privilege or by the idea that you have it since your relationship to it has more nuance? So I'm going to stop the screen share now. And I would like to invite everyone who is interested and able to be able to come onto the screen. Is that something we can do, Elliot?
Yes, let me just do that. I have to go person by person, but I'll make everybody a co-host, and then you can join in. I think I've done it.
Okay.
Oh, wait, you know, hang on. Bear with me, I'm sorry. I'm just doing it. Okay. Everybody is now a panelist. Everybody can now speak.
Great. And if you guys would like to turn on your webcams, I'd love to see your beautiful faces. It's nice to see some new faces and some of the same faces.
Elliot, are we stopping recording? Is that?
If you want me to, I can. Just you tell me.
We didn't last time. Are you guys all comfortable? Is there anybody who's not comfortable with this part being recorded and us all participating? You can type it in the chat if you'd like, privately, either to me or Ravari or Elliot, or you can say it. All right. So I'm gonna take that from my end as a yes. Okay. Great. Thank you for allowing other people to be able to watch and learn from all of our experiences. And I want us to go over a lot of the things that I just spoke about directly. But first, if you don't mind, Judy, if you remember your takeaway from last time, I said that we were going to discuss it again now. I don't know if you want to sort of introduce the way that you had mentioned it. Sorry to put you on the spot. You can say no if you don't want to. You're still muted.
Okay. Unfortunately, I did take notes from your wonderful presentation last time, but I've been a little disorganized because one of my cousins passed away, and so I didn't retrieve my notes, so I don't remember what I said.
Okay.
I could take the time to get the note and we can get back to, or if you have the notes, then we could take it from there.
I don't know if anybody else is having a little bit of trouble hearing you. It's the microphone is really low. But
Sorry.
I think I got the gist of what you're saying. That
I have my notes in a bind, and
I'm not going to make you go through them again. So I rewatched the end. Oh, but if you found them, that's great. But I rewatched the end, and the microphone was a little low then too. But I'm pretty sure, from what I remember too, that it was more of a question of, you know, especially, and if anybody else remembers and wants to chime in, that especially as we're dealing with COVID and the change in privileges that a lot of people are facing, and a lot of those things are conflated with white privilege, especially when you have these conversations interracially, and we're looking at a lot of the things that Black Lives Matter as a movement or as an organization, the movement for Black Lives. is sort of putting out there that it assumes a certain overlap with class and whiteness in privilege, and that may not be something that's so true right now. And how do we deal with that for ourselves, and then still sort of give where we can. And I don't know if this is where you were going with it, but for me, that also brings up the concept a lot of how do we pour from an empty cup almost, or like a less full than it would usually be cup. The simple answer to that is you don't. But I think I'd like us to all go through talking about that. So I want to know if anybody had a reaction, like an immediate one, or just as they were thinking about it, to the piece that I just read, and to anything else that I've said in the last half hour. Rosette, go ahead.
Well, within white privilege, there are shades of privilege, because we're, like you said, it's more than just one thing. There's a diversity to that story of the privilege. Those with disabilities, those of a different, who have gender problems, and that all of this is part of this, what is white privilege and how much there is to it for each person.
Okay.
That's what I got out of it.
That's, I think, a really important point. And I think actually to make it very simple to define it, white privilege is the privilege of walking into a room or a space or being seen, and to an extent being heard, because there's an assumption of what a white voice sounds like. And so this is one of the ways that I often end up accessing white privilege. And that's a whole other story that we could get into about how people end up feeling betrayed when they then see me. But to be able to do that, and there are it is rare that there would be a negative assumption made about you from that particular part of the first impression.
Not until they hear my story can they see
Right.
that there might be.
Right, that just literally just at first glance or first hearing of what you look like or who you are, how you sound, that who you are is worth hearing the rest of the story even, to most structural places in this country, other than, specific places that we call niche or ethnic, where the privilege is sometimes reversed. And that is, I'm going to say this now, even though it's a bit of a non sequitur, it's very different for privilege to be reversed in specific settings than to say that there is reverse racism, because racism is defined as the structural power, not just the day-to-day interactions. So on that level, there's no such thing as reverse racism. There is certainly prejudice, and that can go in any direction. Racial prejudice can happen in any direction. So there's also no such thing as reverse racial prejudice. It's just racial prejudice that's against a group that's traditionally privileged. I just wanted to make sure that I make that point clear. That's a reason that people may get incensed if you ever say reverse racism, because it's structural and we don't have the power, basically, as people who are non-white, to change what that structure is on a level all by ourselves, although that is a lot of what various movements right now are trying to work towards, is the idea that lives and the living, not just the being alive, matters at that same level structurally. But yeah, there's intersectionality is a really important concept that, if you don't understand, makes it very easy to feel attacked by the word privilege, and by being told that you have it, because we all have stories. Every single person on this earth has their struggles, and sometimes privilege even comes with struggles. I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like to be that kid a few years ago who had that terrible DUI and got off with affluenza. I mean, he certainly had a lot of economic privilege that was just handed to him. He unfortunately ended the lives of other people with it and was not subject to anything other than probation. However, to be a person who is that devoid of being able to actually learn lessons in life, that to me is sort of a punishment too. Nowhere near as bad as some of the other punishments that could have happened, and nowhere near as bad as the consequence, of course, that other people faced in that situation. But it does come with, all privileges come with their own struggles and responsibilities. So what's being spoken about when we talk about intersectionality is recognizing the places where your privilege does not contribute to the other struggles that you have, and that it makes things easier, and recognizing that with that privilege is a responsibility to be aware of the fact that you have it, and when you have the ability and energy from other parts of your life, to use it to help other people, just as you would like other people's to be used to help you. We expect in this country that people with a certain level of economic privilege are going to contribute to those with less economic privilege in a certain way. We expect in this country that people with gender privilege are going to use it to help people with less gender privilege in a different way. And I'm not even talking about in social justice movements where, where we're talking about a spectrum of genders and we hope that people will actively fight for rights. I'm even talking about, let's just go back to the stereotypes of the 50s. And I'm saying stereotypes. People who were gendered male were expected to use that privilege to have a certain type of job that then they use to provide people who were gendered female with some level of security. So really, that's what our social contract asks. And the racial privilege part of that is really murky because we created race in a very interesting way, and we created the divisions and the initial sort of social contract that the US had as far as what type of help racial privilege would mean would be a level of, okay, well, I'm going to make the decisions for you. You are not responsible for that. I'm going to make sure that you have something that at least resembles a roof over your head because I take care of my cattle, essentially. And so now when we're talking about it on a more existential level rather than a substantive level, it's harder to figure out. It sort of goes back to Maslow's hierarchy. Okay, well, you don't want, and then the conversation goes, well, if you want these things taken care of, go back to slavery. Well, no, we're not saying Black folks are not necessarily saying we want you to provide housing for us because you're white. We're saying we would like to no longer be denied housing and have redlining happen where for some points we literally were not allowed to buy homes or even rent in certain areas. For when we move in, this still happens. For when we move into an area, the place to go down in property value and for white flight to happen. And you know what, I want to bring up this article. Assessment, okay, assessment, interracial couple. This just recently happened. Okay, it was also in the Wall Street Journal. I'm just clicking on the first Google that I see. The Root is a really good website for seeing things if you want a particular perspective. This literally just happened. An interracial couple's home received a higher appraisal after removing all signs of Blackness from the house. they are both economically privileged people and educationally privileged people. So the Hortons live just minutes from the Ortega River in a predominantly white neighborhood. The general appraisal is $350 to $550. When they had the appraiser come and they were both home and everything, all of their family photos were up. They do have children. The home was appraised for $330,000. They ordered a second appraisal. The wife is a lawyer. She took all of the family photos off the mantle. Everything was just of her husband. All of the African and African American art was taken down, everything that symbolized any connection to the Black community. And the husband was left home alone with the new appraiser, and they received a home value of $465,000. That is a huge difference. And, you might say, okay, well, it's just these two appraisers just appraised very differently. Yeah, if that wasn't something that was a very common thing. So again, when we talk about privilege, even when we talk about economic privilege and just by dint of being white, having more access to it, they literally had access to an extra $110,000, I think, if I'm doing the math. No, sorry, $135,000 just by removing signs of Blackness. $135,000. What would you do with that money? And think about the fact that these people are literally, they're educated. They have economic privilege. They were able to afford a home that is being appraised at $465,000 in the first place. And now they want to put it on the market. Like, that's what we're talking about when we say use your white privilege in these moments. Is he used it. They took down all the Blackness. He used his white privilege. It's going to uplift all of them. It's sad that it has to be on this simple level. Yes, Elliot.
That's a pretty amazing story. I appreciate you sharing that. I hadn't seen that. And I think it really, obviously it's only one example, but I think it's a very powerful example. I wanted to just go back and ask, well, give a reflection and if you have any thoughts around the following, which is the notion of white privilege and privilege generally, I think has been, has lost its meaning in public discourse and discussion. And it's become almost like an epithet that you throw at someone and say, oh, that's just your white privilege showing, or check your privilege, etc. And people aren't thinking about it in a more nuanced way, as you were just sharing before, in terms of, privilege is not the be all end all. It opens doors, but there are complexities, there are problems. There are areas where there is privilege, and yet other areas where other aspects of an identity may not be privileged, and there's a lot of complication, let's just say, the intersectionality. And how do you just deal with, you raise the issue of privilege in the conversation, and someone just has that kind of like knee-jerk reaction because they're just thinking about it in a very one-dimensional kind of way.
So is your question, if we in this room right now are the ones who are saying, please acknowledge your privilege, not necessarily check your privilege, not using it as an epithet, but saying that, and then somebody has a knee-jerk reaction, or are you saying the opposite?
No, but yes, that is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think I'm going to actually answer the question I thought you might be asking first to help elucidate the other answer. If you feel like someone is throwing at you as an epithet and you know that your story is more intersectional than that, the easiest way and the realest way, honestly, to disarm them, if they in any way, shape, or form are trying to actually engage in conversation with you, is to say, what privilege are you assuming that I have? What access are you assuming that I have because of which privilege? Because there are parts of my identity where I certainly have access to privilege and parts that I don't, and some are assumed and some are not. And it doesn't have to be quite that long, but you know, something along those lines. What are you assuming is my privilege? What access are you assuming? And so I would say that if you're trying to encourage someone else to analyze their privilege, that you ask yourself the same question first. What am I assuming is their privilege? And how am I assuming that it impacts their life? And how can I say this in a way that I sort of spiral in to using the word privilege? But at first I just describe what's actually happening. So, you know, I mean, and that's sort of what we were just doing with even that article. We went over, these are what these people do have. I mean, obviously he has more racial privilege, but I didn't have to say that at the beginning. I described the actual circumstance and how that played out, and then kind of ended it with, so this is how the privilege, his white privilege helps benefit both of them. So it can be, instead of pointing it out to them, hey, this is your privilege, analyze it, saying, hey, this is what I'm hearing in these stories, and I want to encourage you to think about how this angle of privilege, or this aspect of your identity, you can even say, how the aspect of you being a white presenting male, or, you know, an upper middle class educated woman, how these stations in life influenced your ability to navigate this circumstance in a way that other people won't have, just by not having those privileged identities. So you can't just make it so boiled down and simple and expect it to be a real conversation, I think, is really what that sums up to. You kind of have to have it be a conversation. You need to ask yourself the hard questions before you confront somebody else about it. You know, if I had come in here to the room saying, look, we all have whatever Jewish privilege is or isn't, we all have the assumptions that come with that in the Jewish community, but I'm Black, and so therefore, just because you guys all look white, you have so much more privilege than me in every way possible. Check your privilege. Now listen to me. We're not really engaging in conversation. I think we'd all have a much different takeaway than me acknowledging where I have privilege, where some of you may not, and discussing that, and discussing how it intersects and how that privilege is sort of stripped just by dint of the color of my skin, and how I'm acknowledging that in your stories, that may be something in some ways that you experience too, whether it's from Jewishness, or from, you know, which I also experience and can relate to, or from age, or from gender or sex, or any other identity piece. You know, citizenship was something I think that we talked about, and the way we use language and education were all discussed last time too.
So,
Okay, it is all about the storytelling. We are all hearing different stories. We all have different stories about what's going on and how it will affect us in our heads. The story that one person tells, where it's a huge example of privilege, to another person is an example of smartly using the connections and resources that they have, but having had the seichel to take advantage of those things, and it wasn't just handed to them. They had to, you know, work for it. And when those stories are so incompatible and one side can't understand that there is a different facet of this, that these are the same story, there's a different facet of it, then there is no ability to come to agreement. But the most important thing in order to even try is to get to the actual story and hear it. So I would encourage you to work on saving up the energy and tolerance and patience to ask him for what his story is, and hear it, really hear it. Why does he think this way? what is he scared of? And challenge him in some of the moments, you know, like I did with my friend about the looting and rioting. And I said, you know what, there's been conversations about who may actually be perpetrating that, but also what I flat out said actually was, what would you say if we had had a similar reaction to Kristallnacht? And she said that she felt like that was a bad example because the things that are happening are more like Kristallnacht now. And I'm like, yes, but it's actually, I'm using it as a delicate example, if anything, or as like a step down example, because people are protesting because of lives destroyed, not businesses. So with that in mind, how would you feel if we, like, would you think that we as Jews were doing the wrong thing if we responded to Kristallnacht with these shows of across the country? Let's even say there were no, I'm sorry, this thing is beeping. Sorry about that. That, let's say that there were no peaceful protests. Let's just pretend that everything was violent and that there was destruction and loss of life every single time. How would you feel about us having done that in response to Kristallnacht? I still haven't actually gotten an answer. I've just been told that it's not, you know, a good example because what's happening now is more like Kristallnacht. And I'm going to keep pushing for an actual answer because we can have like a real conversation about it. But we have a very different view of what the stories are of what's happening. I also personally swear if I hear one more, the narrative, it doesn't fit the narrative, I might throw up. But okay, well, what is the narrative that you think is happening? And is that actually what you hear coming out of my mouth? Because it's not. And so you're saying that, you know, these news sources won't tell a certain side of the story because of the so-called narrative? Maybe you're right. Maybe we can even agree on that. Now what? What is the narrative you think is being told by the other side? Are you hearing that come out of my mouth in this conversation? And that's true, you know, on both sides. And unfortunately, right now, it really is both. It's separated. But what is the story that you're afraid of? What is the story you're actually hearing? What are you digesting? What is your personal story from that? Can I hear you? Can I not hear Fox News or CNN? Can I not hear Breitbart and MSNBC? I trust you to be a smart person who actually has the ability to have an intellectual conversation about this, and I think that you've thought it through. So can we have a conversation about it? And if you need to start with talking points and kind of circle in, because that's how most people are going to do it, this is why I say you got to build up the patience first. Fine, do that. And I'm going to listen. It's going to be hard for me, but I'm going to listen to you. And I ask, again, foundation of the rules of engagement, I ask that you intend all of it with respect, and I will assume that you're intending all of it with respect. And I ask that you give me the respect of also hearing my side. And I understand, and you have to understand this, especially if you have a longer period of time in this as an ongoing relationship, as it is for many of us, that you may not be able to hear me respond right away. I'm going to be chomping at the bit. But you've just poured your whole heart out. You've poured out every point. You know, I let you talk to the point where like you've really explored it. You've gotten to the personal. You may not be in a space where you can hear anything that I have to say because you might be vulnerable. And it might be fragile, not necessarily fragility, but just fragile because we're human. And whenever anybody pours their heart out on what they think about something, especially if they're afraid that there are legitimate challenges to it and they're not ready to let go of that view because they've stood so sternly on it, and they might have even heard themselves say things that they're like, wait a minute, that's not actually where I am, and I just said it and now I have to stick to it. you might not be able to respond right away. Okay, fine. Can we come back to it tomorrow? And can you hear me the same way that I've heard you out? Can we really engage? That's why when my friend kept not really answering the Crystal left point, you know, we kind of ended the conversation, said goodnight, talked about a few other things that we might want to do with our kids together, lighter topics. But another time, I will push and I will ask. You can only get so far in one day because humans are fragile. White fragility is about acknowledging that humans are fragile. It's not the insult that it's often taken as, and more often than it should be used as. It's the idea that whiteness has been this creation that anybody who has actually engaged in any sort of racial studies says damages people who are identified as white just as much as the rest of us. It's erased people's histories. It's erased the ancestral stories and the deep ties and the family lines, and given this hole where an otherwise much richer identity would be. So the fragility comes from this idea that if you break the shell that is whiteness, what's left is this hole in identity. And so people, I think, who have done the work or who know who they are, not by defining themselves in opposition to something else, but like where they actually are and who they are and what their social roles and personal selves are, generally are less fragile in that way, because challenging one aspect of what they're identified as doesn't challenge who they are and how they see themselves, the same way that it would otherwise. But when you go down, you know, political root conversations or intra-racial conversations about race, when you have different viewpoints and you want to help someone check their privilege, you have to realize that you may be asking them to pull the rug out from a certain foundation of their identity that may already be wobbly, and that is terrifying for anyone. The strength that it takes to willingly do that is very high. And I commend anybody who does the work and who's willing to sit and listen or, you know, journal about it, which again, I would encourage everybody to do following this session, to figure out what their stories are and how, when they talk out loud to another person, to share their version of things, and to ask them to evaluate some piece of themselves. What are they going to be asked to do in return? You know, what should we be asked to do? Why? And how can we make it reciprocal in a way that is still healthy and beneficial to ourselves, not undermining to our values? I actually would love us all now to go through some storytelling, like a little bit of storytelling practice and maybe some story listening practice, some that may be easier to hear and some that may not. I think in our own ways, everybody is a storyteller. I've heard some of the stories and some of the questions already from a few people. And if no one wants to volunteer, I'll go first. But I would love to hear a short version of how you see why you come to this conversation, your story version of that. We can be brave.
I wasn't part of the conversation last week because I was on another webinar, but I did see the archived version, so I wasn't able to interject. The term privilege sort of woke me up to a lot of things because I didn't take my upbringing as being privileged. It was just my ordinary upbringing with parents that gave me certain standards or certain opportunities or certain exposure to interracial people that they knew or to interaction, though part of my life was lived in a very Jewish community, and so it had those exposures. But I was raised with do unto others as you would want them to do unto you, and keeping certain things equal. So until you talked about privilege, I just thought it was my ordinary way of life. My privilege that I was missing was the one of being female versus male, because I was in a situation in school where I was the only girl in a class, or people, made comments and different things. Nowadays, because there's such a period of time in between, it's non-existent by comparison. But in the 60s at college, the issue of being female with all males in the class came up with comments, came up with other things. Even after graduation with pretty decent marks, I couldn't get jobs, positions in certain firms because I was female. I couldn't earn the same kind of money, even though I got better grades than the boys that were making a lot more money. So it was a different aspect of it. But in a period of all this time, since I'm now old, basically, you think about things, and with this epidemic, you have time to think about things differently. I'm not quite sure I'm ready to undertake some of the people I know that are way on the other side of my thought process. I'm not quite sure because they're also older and they're very set in their ways, and it probably would take more of an effort to try and get through to them. They're set in their ways. I may be sort of set in my ways. But watching the younger generation, watching children and grandchildren, you see a big difference in that exposure. So I have taken some notes. I will read some articles. I'll try to build up my resilience, and we'll see where it goes from there. And we'll see if I still have any family that talks to me after all that.
And that last part I think is also really important. Like, that's a part of a story, is using privilege but risking really important relationships too. There is risk involved, not just, and that's a big part of identity too. I'm a member of this family. Maybe I believe differently than them, but is standing up for that belief going to get me, to have no family?
Right.
Which is a noble risk to take, and hopefully means also that you feel like you have chosen family enough, where you won't end up being super lonely afterwards. But it's still, it's a big part of anybody's story. What does it take to change my mind or change anybody else's mind? What do I lose if I change my mind? Do I lose ego? Do I lose face? Do I lose identity? Do I lose family? Do I lose my job, and my livelihood? Like, what is the loss? What is the risk that I take? And then also, of course, what is the risk that I take of not speaking up, which, usually that's what makes people speak up, because then they feel like, okay, but now I'm losing my soul a little bit. And maybe that's more important to me. Maybe I'm at a place where where I can still make sure that I can eat and have a roof over my head, and that I will have some people that I love, or I will find new people to love, and I don't feel like I'm losing my soul. It's definitely a balancing act, for sure.
And you value your friends who you picked over the years, because you pick them with similar types of characteristics, and you've been able to talk to them for the last umpteen years and work it out over time. So they just become more valuable in some cases.
Yeah, and we tell the story of the value of those relationships too. I mean, for some of those people, that story may be, I value this relationship more than the way that I see the world outside of this relationship, and I'm therefore not going to bring this conversation into it. For some, it may be, I value this relationship, and my story includes that it's strong enough of a relationship, and that we respect and love each other in a way that allows us to have really different stories about the world and actually engage in it and still be able to see each other as a whole person. So the narrative that we tell ourselves and that we accept that other people are hearing or seeing about themselves and the world is a really important one to identify. We talked a little bit about red flags and green flags and yellow flags last time, and it was in the packet that it was made available for download. And that's a big part of our storytelling too. It's something that I'd like you guys to leave with as a part of your storytelling kit, to recognize what are the things that people say that this is my yellow flag. I'm now going into a place where my eyes widen, where I'm starting to think of a response rather than listen to what they're saying, and everything that they're saying is now going to be colored by what I think they meant. When you notice yourself hearing and listening to a story and you start feeling that, that's a yellow flag. When you're telling a story and you notice yourself getting into the point where it feels like it's rhetoric, it feels like if you don't get this point across, then you failed in the conversation, that is also a yellow flag. The red flags, maybe orange, but usually red, include things like, this person is never going to understand what I feel. This person is a terrible human being. How did I miss that? I'm never going to be able to talk to them again. Like when you start getting into black and white thinking about who a person is because of one conversation and one version of their storytelling, then that's definitely a red flag, and maybe time to back away from the conversation and say, you know what, hold on, the way you're talking about this, I can't think that we're going to go any farther right now. Clearly, I have some thinking to do about myself. Make it about you, and let them call it white fragility if they want to. But once you own it, it's definitely less fragile. If you say, please stop, I need to go think about myself and reflect on what you've said, because it's overwhelming to me, or because it's hard for me to understand how someone could think that, and I need to take some space. That's you acknowledging your own boundaries, and making it so that your own storytelling and story listening can be significantly more productive, whatever productive ends up meaning, whether it's to change minds, your own or somebody else's, or just, productive for your day-to-day mental health and life. And how much patience you have for anybody or anything else in your life. How much of that cup do you have to pour into somebody else? Is it going to drain it? And you can say, you know what, this is emptying my cup too fast. Let's take a break. You can say that also when you get to yellow flags. You can say, you know what, this is starting to be really uncomfortable for me, and I appreciate the discomfort. Can we take it a little slower? Can I ask some questions? Can I tell you? And again, this is something we discussed at the end last time. Can I tell you? Are you open to hearing where I am right now so that we can move further? Like, can we have a story together where we're weaving this in and out, not just me listening to yours and then you listening to mine, but it's a conversation, so maybe we can weave it together. So those are, I think, some big storytelling and story listening tips that I want to make sure that we all walk away from this with. If anybody else has another story that they want to share, or some feedback or an example that they can think of when they did that and they wouldn't have noticed it, or when retrospectively they're realizing they could have noticed it, and now having this tool might be helpful. I'd love to hear it. Rosette?
I have a couple of different stories. One, I never thought of myself in the terms of white privilege because of in my young years, in my formative years, I lived in an apartment building that my grandmother owned. So that whole building was basically all relatives and Jewish. But we didn't live, we lived in a neighborhood that had basically been changing. And it was mainly more now Italian and Greek, and Black Americans were moving in. And the Jewish number, there were some, but not a lot. It was on the west side of Chicago. It was the Garfield Park, Austin area. And in school and things, of course, I would be pointed out as the Jewish girl who was doing very well. And why was she doing so well? Because she was Jewish. And a girlfriend that I had we're roller skating, we're friends, and all of a sudden out of her mouth comes that, Jews, are terrible. So I got a feeling of being a little bit of an underdog in a sense. So I didn't see my white privilege. But as I got older and I started looking for jobs and things, and I'm not putting down that I'm Jewish and stuff, it's not asking, I guess that might have been my white privilege that took me out of my negatives of being Jewish. And so now when we start this whole conversation on white privilege, it made me start thinking of myself in a different way. That, hey, I do have some white privilege. I am white. I have some white privilege that I didn't realize that I had before. And I had one incident where I was going to make a job change. Now that I'm getting older, after college, I was working. I worked as a teacher and stopped to raise my children. And when I went to go back, jobs weren't so easy. And I thought, well, maybe I'll change careers. So I went to, University of Michigan in the Detroit area, and went into a career counseling place to take some tests. And one of the things the counselor had said to me is, I had now, while my children were little, I had worked at Sunday school. I had taught a little bit in Hebrew school. So this was my new resume. Now I have some Jewish things on my resume that I didn't have when I first started out. And the counselor said to me not to put those Jewish things, because if somebody who's in the HR takes a look at it and has some kind of anti-Semitic feelings, that will knock me out. So again, that made me think of myself in another way. And then also as an adult, I have a daughter who is gay, and I have a very dear girlfriend from high school who is religious. And when I came out to her that my daughter was gay, the first thing she said to me is, that's against our religion, but because you're my dear friend, I'm going to stay your friend. Well, that was very hurtful to me. And it took me a while to be able to say, well, I know she's coming from a different perspective, from an Orthodox perspective, a different perspective that I have. But she has so many other wonderful qualities that I do like about her. I still have never let her know how it was hurtful to me. We just, and she knows that she's gay, and I know that she knows that she's gay, and we go on as if there's nothing there. That's just my story, a bunch of all over the place kinds of things.
And all of those stories inform how you see your worldview, what privileges have been denied you, what privileges you do have access to. The fact that I've had similar, when I was first out of college, I would put things like that I was the vice president and then president of Hillel, and people told me to take it off if I wasn't applying to a specifically Jewish job for the same reason. I also was a part of the AHANA Leadership Council, which is the students of color part of the undergraduate government. And I was told to take that off too, so that people looked at my resume. But there was the point that, but when I walk in, my Blackness is still there. Like, the Jewishness is also still there, but they don't know that unless we get into a certain part of the conversation. And that is where the white privilege does come in. It's something that and also where whiteness is damaging even to white people, because you have to erase a piece of yourself that's important in order to maintain the privilege that it will grant you. This is also part of, I think, why some people get so upset when they're told that they have white privilege or another sort of privilege. And it's similar to that whole, I had the seichel to use my resources. Well, okay, but I had to deny a piece of myself in order to gain access to that privilege. It makes it like, okay, well, so yes, I have this privilege, but it didn't come without a cost. That's also something to remember, both for yourself when you're checking in with yourself, that's a real story. It's a valid story, and it's also a valid story for other people, that privileges can come with a cost. They may be handed to somebody, but maybe they're handed as something burning hot, you know? So we have, I think, about 6 more minutes. So I want to thank you guys very much for genuinely participating. I do want to be able to send some sort of like follow-up thoughts or articles if there's anything that everybody's interested in. So similar to last time, if there's any last takeaway or question or thing you want to throw out there, I invite us to go around and say it. And I'm going to put also, please know that I am working on this website because it's old, but I'm now reformatting it, but it's a good way to get in contact and find some resources. And I'll be developing actually an entire course that is a few different courses on how to have a conversation when race is the elephant in the room without sticking your foot in your mouth, or at the very least being able to extract it gracefully. So I want to invite all of you guys to check it out, to participate if you are interested. And I'd love to hear a takeaway or a question or something that you'd like help learning further. Judy.
So first, thank you so much. I came to participate to learn and to help me to counter stereotypes in conversations with several people that I'm friends with and that I have difficulty helping them to see this racism and stereotype from a different perspective. And I think one of the issues that's missing is feelings. How does it feel? And then fill in the blank. And not enough emphasis is given to how does it feel? And you might want to address that topic in the future. I mean, that we have a lot of intellectual understanding, but it's very hard for many people to empathize and feel what it might feel like if it was them in that particular situation. I think that's one of the differences in our political, between our political candidates. Some people can really feel, others cannot.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. It's one that be prepared when you keep going with it. People tend to have this exceptionalism about how they think they would feel. And that's a reason that it's often one of the later tools that I use, not one of the earlier ones, because people think their lives are just normal. They think how they would feel based on what they actually are living now, and how they see the world now. And it takes a certain level of soul searching and ability to empathize and of really understanding somebody, like genuinely understanding someone else's story, and that they genuinely have a different perspective before they can imagine how they might actually feel if they lived a similar life, in my experience. But you're right, it is definitely a good tool when you're having a personal conversation with a friend about this, to talk about that part. It makes it more real and more personal, for sure. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
And thank you for all your hard work in this area.
I don't have a single takeaway. I just have a lot of, need to still do a lot of processing, but I found it very, very encouraging, and gives me cause for optimism. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is to have respond with curiosity as opposed to reactivity. You know, to be able to respond and say, "Huh, that's interesting. Like, where are you coming from with that?" Or how do you see that? You know, just with a response of curiosity, because a curiosity can be something that's engaging and creates interaction and draws someone out, as opposed to why do you think that, or that's crazy. You know, that kind of reaction is a conversation ender, whereas just curiosity, someone is going to want to fill in the blank. So that, I think, is my biggest takeaway, and that's very powerful to me.
Thank you for that feedback. Yeah, it makes a difference. You leave space for someone to actually have the thoughts that they have and the feelings that they have, without saying, I'm definitely going to shut you down. And you give them the opportunity to teach you something too, even if it's not something you're going to adopt later. It becomes reciprocal.
Could you share that article that you were reading at the beginning?
Which
The white
one?
privilege article by that
sure.
woman who's talking about white privilege in class and all. That was a really terrific essay.
Yeah, it's one I've used for quite a few years, actually. So I just put the link there, but I'll also download it and add it.
Thank
I
you.
think that's to everybody. I hope that's to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Hold on, I'm gonna make sure that it's to everybody. There we go.
Are some of these articles on your website? If we go to your website?
I didn't hear the beginning of what you just said.
Some of these articles that you just showed us, would they be on, could we find them also on your website?
Right now, no, they're on there, but they're not. But because I'm like reformatting, I've taken a lot of the older things down. That are a lot. But you know what? I'll put a small resources section that I will make sure, like the hidden resources, I guess. And I can email the link to that, or some of the links that are still accessible. They're just, you have to actually go directly to the link, not navigate to it. So I can email that over to Elliot. And
Yeah, send it to me, and my email is on the shul directory, and you can just email me. And I've written down who's been attending, and I will also share it out.
yeah. And I'll also like put a little link there for, for Skokie Valley participants, and then you guys can click on and see those specific links.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for participating.
Well, I find you very thought-provoking.
Thank you for allowing yourself to have your thoughts be provoked. I do appreciate it. I wish I always had audiences this receptive. I mean, thankfully I often do, but not always. So it's always nice to have that. to have people who are willing to engage in the thought.
Well, I've been a member of many different shuls all over the country, and I always come back and say there is something really unique and special about Skokie Valley Shul and the people who go there.
I'm
So,
hoping that I get to actually visit you guys at some
yes.
point.
I was gonna
That
say, I hope you'll
we
come out.
all are healthy, and that we all have a Shana Tova.
Thank you.
So maybe sealed and signed and move into to the next year with good health and good thought, and the reminder to forgive yourself too, as well as other people, and to approach yourself with the same curiosity as I'm suggesting you approach other people's stories.
Thank you so much, and to you and your family as well.
Thank you.
All the best. Take care.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye.